The school day has ended, and the campus has mostly emptied. The air is still, filled only with the faint rustle of leaves in the soft breeze. The orange glow of the setting sun blankets the parking lot, casting long, stretching shadows over rows of parked cars and a few scattered students. It's the kind of quiet that feels ordinary, uneventful. At the edge of this calm scene stands a young black teenager, Jordan Carter. He's leaning against the base of the school's tall white flagpole, scrolling through his phone. His earbuds dangle loosely around his neck, their muted music faintly audible. A basketball peeks out of his slightly unzipped backpack, which hangs casually over one shoulder. He glances down the road every now and then, waiting for his father's car to pull up. Everything about this moment is routine, but not for long. The distant hum of an engine begins to grow louder, breaking the stillness. It's subtle at first, barely noticeable against the ambient noise of the suburban landscape. Then it becomes sharper, closer, a sound that commands attention. The source soon comes into view. A police cruiser, its polished exterior gleaming under the fading sunlight. The vehicle slows as it turns into the school parking lot, its tires crunching over the loose gravel near the curb. Jordan doesn't react immediately. He glances briefly at the car but returns to his phone, assuming it's just passing through. But the cruiser doesn't continue. It comes to a deliberate stop, its engine rumbling like a low warning growl. From the car steps Officer Daniels, a man whose presence has become all too familiar on this campus. Known for his rigid demeanor and sharp, unrelenting gaze, Daniels is the kind of officer who prides himself on keeping things in order. For many students, his appearance is enough to spark unease, especially for those who've had the misfortune of crossing his path. His reputation isn't for kindness. It's for being overzealous and, at times, needlessly confrontational. Daniels stands by his car for a moment, his gaze scanning the parking lot. His eyes land on Jordan, standing alone by the flagpole, and narrow slightly. His expression shifts. What might have been casual observation hardens into suspicion. To Daniels, Jordan isn't just a student waiting for a ride. He's a potential threat, a figure that doesn't belong in this quiet after-school scene. The officer adjusts his belt, his hand brushing against the holster at his side. His posture stiffens, and his stride becomes deliberate as he moves toward Jordan. The once calm parking lot now feels tense, the air heavy with the weight of unspoken assumptions. "Hey, you there," Daniels calls out, his voice sharp, slicing through the quiet. It's not a greeting. It's a command. Jordan looks up, startled by the sudden interruption. He pulls one earbud from his ear, the faint sound of music fading into silence. His expression is neutral, calm, but there's a flicker of confusion in his eyes. "Yes, officer?" he asks, his tone polite yet cautious. Daniels doesn't answer right away. Instead, he stops a few feet from Jordan, his gaze sweeping over him with scrutiny. To the officer, every detail of the boy's appearance, his clothes, his bag, even the basketball peeking out, becomes a point of suspicion. Daniels' hand lingers near his belt, as though preparing for something, though nothing warrants it. "What are you doing here?" Daniels asks, his voice gruff. There's no friendliness, no curiosity, only accusation. Jordan blinks, confused by the question. "I'm just waiting for my dad to pick me up," he replies evenly, his voice steady but unsure of why he's being questioned. Daniels doesn't acknowledge the answer. His gaze shifts to Jordan's backpack, his focus narrowing. "What's in the bag?" he asks, the edge in his tone growing sharper. Jordan hesitates, caught off guard by the sudden interrogation. He gestures toward the bag. "Just my books and gym clothes. I had basketball practice." But Daniels isn't convinced. To him, the answer is too simple, too convenient. "Put it on the ground," he orders. "Now." The peaceful stillness of the parking lot is gone, replaced by an uneasy tension. Around them, the few remaining students pause, turning their heads toward the commotion. Parents waiting in nearby cars begin to take notice. A soft murmur spreads through the onlookers, their expressions a mix of confusion and concern. Jordan hesitates for a moment, unsure of how to respond. His mind races with memories of his father's advice. Stay calm. Don't escalate. Comply if necessary. Slowly, he lowers his backpack to the ground, stepping back as instructed. His hands remain visible at his sides, a quiet signal of compliance. Daniels steps closer, kneeling down to unzip the bag. The contents spill out: textbooks, a pair of sneakers, and the basketball, now rolling slightly on the pavement. It's all perfectly ordinary, perfectly innocent. But Daniels doesn't back down. Instead, he picks up the basketball, turning it over in his hands as though expecting to find something hidden beneath its surface. "What's this?" Daniels asks, his voice dripping with disdain. Jordan stares at him, bewildered. "It's a basketball," he says, his tone calm, but tinged with frustration. Daniels smirks, his grip tightening on the ball. "Don't get smart with me, kid," he snaps. And just like that, the quiet after-school routine is gone, replaced by the simmering tension of an encounter that should never have happened. The tranquility of the nearly deserted parking lot dissolves under the sharp tone of Officer Daniels's voice. "Hey, you there!" The words pierce through the air like a thunderclap, snapping the teenager's attention away from his phone. He pulls out one earbud, his calm demeanor shifting to quiet alertness. "Yes, officer?" he asks, his voice steady but cautious. His posture remains neutral, though the tension in his shoulders is barely perceptible. Daniels strides toward him with measured steps, his boots scuffing loudly against the pavement. One hand rests on his belt, dangerously close to the holster that holds his weapon. His other hand motions toward the teen as if to assert authority. "What are you doing here?" Daniels demands, his tone gruff and interrogative. "This area is off limits after hours." The teenager blinks, momentarily taken aback. His confusion is evident, but he keeps his tone respectful. "I'm waiting for my dad," he explains. "He's picking me up from practice. He should be here any minute." Daniels doesn't acknowledge the explanation. His eyes narrow, scanning the boy from head to toe as if searching for something out of place. His gaze lingers on the backpack slung over one shoulder, its partially unzipped top, revealing the orange curve of a basketball. "What's in the bag?" Daniels asks abruptly. His tone isn't curious, it's accusatory. Jordan hesitates, unsure of what to make of the sudden escalation. "Just my books and gym clothes," he replies, gesturing toward the bag. "I had basketball practice earlier." Daniel's expression hardens, and he raises his hand in a commanding gesture. "Don't touch it. Put it on the ground. Step back." The words strike like a whip, sharp and unyielding. The teenager freezes momentarily, processing the order. His mind races with the silent mantra instilled in him by years of warnings. Stay calm. Don't escalate. Comply if necessary. Slowly, he lowers the backpack to the pavement and takes a step back, his hands visible and raised slightly to his sides. Satisfied with the display of submission, Daniels steps forward. His movements are deliberate, almost theatrical, as he crouches beside the bag. Without asking for permission, he unzips it fully and begins rifling through its contents. Textbooks spill onto the asphalt, the hardcovers landing with dull thuds. A pair of well-worn sneakers follows, one shoe rolling slightly before coming to a stop. Finally, the basketball, a bright orange sphere scuffed from hours of use, rolls a short distance before wobbling to a halt near Daniel's boot. "What's this?" Daniels mutters, picking up the ball as if it were evidence of some nefarious act. He turns it over in his hands, inspecting it with unnecessary scrutiny. The teen watches, his face a carefully maintained mask of calm, but the subtle tightening of his jaw betrays the frustration simmering beneath the surface. "It's a basketball," he says slowly, his voice tinged with disbelief at the absurdity of the question. Daniels straightens, holding the ball in one hand and glaring at the boy. His eyes narrow further, his lips curling into a smirk. "Don't get smart with me, kid," he snaps, his tone laced with condescension. Jordan's fists clench momentarily at his sides, but he quickly loosens them, taking a deep breath to steady himself. The humiliation burns, but he refuses to let it show. Around him, the subtle murmurs of the crowd that has begun to gather grow louder. A few parents waiting in their cars have stepped out, their attention drawn by the commotion. Some students still lingering after practice are watching from a distance, their expressions a mixture of confusion and unease. Daniels notices the growing audience, but pretends not to. Instead, he shifts his focus back to the boy. "Why were you hanging around here alone?" he presses, trying to scope something out. "No, sir," Jordan responds firmly. His voice is calm, though the faint tremor in it reveals the effort it takes to remain composed. "I told you, I'm just waiting for my dad." The officer scoffs, tossing the basketball back into the pile of belongings with an exaggerated motion. "Waiting for your dad," he repeats mockingly. "That's convenient. Got any ID?" Jordan hesitates again. "It's in my pocket," he says carefully, keeping his tone neutral. "Can I take it out?" Daniels gestures with an impatient wave of his hand. "Slowly," he warns. Jordan reaches into his back pocket, moving deliberately to avoid any sudden gestures. He pulls out his school ID and hands it to the officer, who snatches it from his hand. Daniels scrutinizes the card, his brows furrowing as he reads the name. "Jordan Carter," he reads aloud, his tone dripping with skepticism. "And you're just hanging out, waiting for your dad? Sounds a little too convenient." The murmurs from the onlookers grow louder. A few people have pulled out their phones, their cameras pointed at the unfolding scene. Daniels glances at them briefly, his expression tightening. His confidence wavers for a moment, but he quickly masks it with renewed bravado. "I don't think you're being straight with me, kid," Daniels says, his voice rising slightly. "What are you really doing here?" "I've told you the truth," Jordan says, his voice growing firmer. "I haven't done anything wrong." The officer takes a step closer, invading Jordan's personal space. His presence looms, an unspoken challenge. "You better watch your tone," he warns, his voice low and threatening. "You don't want to make this worse for yourself." The air grows heavier with each passing second. The tension is palpable, a simmering force that threatens to boil over. The onlookers shift uneasily, their concern evident in the way they inch closer. Among them, a student raises their phone higher, the red light of the recording button blinking steadily. Jordan stands his ground, his posture straight and his gaze unwavering. Though his heart pounds in his chest, he refuses to back down. "I'm not disrespecting you," he says, his voice steady despite the storm brewing inside him. "But I know my rights." The words land like a hammer blow, shattering the fragile balance of power in the moment. The crowd collectively exhales, a ripple of murmured agreement spreading through them. Daniels falters, his composure slipping for the first time. But before the officer can respond, another voice cuts through the tension. Deep, authoritative, and unmistakably commanding. "Is there a problem here, Officer Daniels?" The crowd parts slightly as a new figure steps forward. Jordan's father, Principal Carter. The officer's head snaps toward the voice, his expression shifting from defiance to sudden realization. And in that instant, the balance of power begins to shift. The officer's voice, sharp and cutting, continues to dominate the quiet parking lot. Do you have any weapons? Drugs? Anything illegal on you? Daniels barks, his tone thick with accusation, as though the question alone could unearth some hidden guilt. Jordan stands firm, his shoulders straight, his hands visibly empty. His heart beats faster, but he keeps his voice steady. No, sir, he replies, his tone calm, but resolute. I've done nothing wrong. The officer steps closer, narrowing the space between them, his gaze fixed and unyielding. He smirks, the kind of smile meant to intimidate rather than reassure. We'll see about that, he mutters, his voice low and mocking. Around them, the parking lot begins to stir. A low murmur rises as a small crowd starts to form. Parents sitting in parked cars roll down their windows, their curiosity piqued by the officer's raised voice. A few students, still lingering after practice, pause to watch. Some stand on the steps leading to the school entrance, while others gather closer, their phones clutched in their hands. The atmosphere shifts. What began as a routine, albeit unwarranted, interaction now feels heavier, fraught with unspoken tension. The onlookers exchange glances, their expressions a mix of confusion, concern, and quiet outrage. One of the students, a tall boy in a hoodie, pulls out his phone and starts recording. The faint glow of the screen illuminates his face as he focuses the camera on the scene. Yo, this is messed up, he mutters under his breath, glancing at the girl beside him. She nods in agreement, pulling out her phone as well. The quiet clicks of recording devices blend with the murmurs of the crowd. The officer notices. He always notices. His eyes dart toward the gathering group, his confidence flickering for just a moment before he tightens his posture. He turns back to Jordan, doubling down on his authority. Empty your pockets, Daniels commands, his voice louder now, almost performative. Let's see what you're hiding. Jordan hesitates, not out of guilt, but because the request feels like a line crossed. I've already shown you everything, he says, his voice firm but controlled. There's nothing to hide. The crowd stirs at his words, their murmurs growing louder. A woman in a parked car steps out, her heels clicking against the asphalt as she folds her arms. What's he supposed to be hiding? She calls out, her voice tinged with skepticism. Daniel's head snaps in her direction, his jaw tightening. Stay back, ma'am, he says curtly. This doesn't concern you. Doesn't concern me? She fires back, taking another step closer. You're harassing a kid who's just standing here. How does that not concern all of us? Her words seem to ignite the crowd. Another parent nods in agreement, stepping closer. He's just waiting for a ride, the man says, his tone calm, but firm. This doesn't look right. The officer's grip on the situation begins to slip. He glares at the growing crowd, his eyes flickering with frustration. Everyone needs to back up, he says, his voice rising. I'm handling the situation. But the crowd doesn't disperse. Instead, they inch closer, emboldened by the collective unease. More phones are raised, their cameras capturing every word, every movement. The sound of whispered commentary mixes with the recording clicks. This is gonna go viral, a girl whispers to her friend, her phone steady in her hands. They can't get away with this anymore. Daniels turns back to Jordan, his composure cracking under the weight of the eyes on him. You think you're smart, don't you? He spits, his voice lower now, meant only for Jordan to hear. Standing here, acting innocent. Jordan meets his gaze without flinching. I'm not acting, he says, his voice quiet but steady. I've done nothing wrong. The officer's face flushes with anger, but before he can respond, the faint sound of footsteps cuts through the air, firm, deliberate, and growing louder with each step. The crowd parts slightly, their murmurs quieting as a tall, commanding figure emerges from the edge of the lot. Dressed in a crisp shirt and tie, his expression a mix of calm authority and restrained anger, Principal Carter steps into view. The balance of power shifts in an instant. The officer's posture stiffens as he recognizes the man. His expression flickers between defiance and unease. The principal's gaze sweeps over the scene, the scattered belongings on the ground, the tense posture of his son, the phones pointed in every direction. "Is there a problem here, Officer Daniels?" the principal asks, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. Daniels hesitates, the authority in his voice suddenly absent. "This student was acting suspiciously," he stammers, gesturing vaguely toward Jordan. "I was investigating." Principal Carter raises an eyebrow, his tone sharp. "This student," he repeats, his voice slow and deliberate, "is my son." The crowd falls silent, their collective gasp audible. Daniel's face pales as the weight of the revelation sinks in. His lips part as if to speak, but no words come. The once confident officer now looks as if the ground beneath him has disappeared. Jordan stands silently, his posture straight, his expression unreadable. He doesn't gloat. There's no need. The truth, now fully revealed, speaks louder than any words could. And as the principal takes another step forward, the tension in the parking lot shifts once more, from fear and outrage to accountability and justice. The sharp crack of a car door slamming slices through the growing tension, silencing the murmurs of the crowd. All eyes turn toward the source of the sound. Striding toward the scene is a tall, commanding figure. His presence alone carries a weight that shifts the dynamic in an instant. It's the school principal, Mr. Carter, dressed impeccably in a crisp white shirt, his tie slightly loosened from the long school day. Mr. Carter exudes an air of quiet authority. His footsteps echo across the pavement, each step deliberate, measured. His face is calm, but his piercing gaze takes in every detail. The scattered belongings on the ground, his son standing motionless, the officer looming over him, and the uneasy crowd growing by the second. He speaks, and his voice, though steady, carries an edge of restrained anger. "What's going on here, Officer Daniels?" Daniels, who had been standing over Jordan with all the confidence of someone wielding unchecked authority, straightens abruptly. The smirk that had lingered on his face vanishes, replaced by a flicker of unease. He clears his throat, visibly unsettled by the principal's presence. "This student was acting suspiciously," Daniels begins, his voice faltering slightly. He gestures vaguely toward Jordan. "I was just investigating." Mr. Carter's gaze shifts to his son. Jordan, standing amidst his upturned belongings, meets his father's eyes. There is no need for words. The relief in Jordan's posture and the silent trust exchanged between them say it all. Slowly, Mr. Carter turns his attention back to Daniels. "This student, Officer Daniels," the principal says, his tone growing sharper, "is my son." For a moment, the world seems to stop. The murmurs of the crowd cease, replaced by a deafening silence. Daniel's face drains of color as the weight of the revelation hits him like a tidal wave. His mouth opens slightly, as if to protest or explain, but no words come. Mr. Carter doesn't wait for him to recover. He takes a step closer, his presence towering. "You've accused my son of being suspicious," he says, his words slow, deliberate, and heavy with meaning. "You've rifled through his belongings, humiliated him in front of his peers, and treated him like a criminal." "For what reason exactly?" Daniels stammers, his composure slipping further. I didn't know," he manages, his voice barely above a whisper. "You didn't know?" Mr. Carter repeats, his voice rising slightly. His calm demeanor begins to crack. allowing a flicker of anger to seep through. You didn't know? So you assumed. Based on what? The color of his skin. The fact that he was standing here, waiting for his father. The crowd, emboldened by the principal's words, stirs. Their murmurs return, louder this time, rippling through the parking lot like waves. Parents nod in agreement, students exchange knowing glances, and phones remain steady, recording every word. Daniels looks around, his confidence evaporating under the weight of the eyes fixed on him. He tries to speak again, but Mr. Carter cuts him off. I've worked at this school for over a decade, the principal says, his voice firm. I've seen hundreds of students, young people trying to succeed despite the odds stacked against them. And I've seen the damage caused by people like you, Officer Daniels. People who wield authority without accountability. Daniels flinches as the words land, each one a blow to his crumbling facade. The crowd murmurs louder, some openly voicing their agreement. This stops here, Mr. Carter continues. His voice, though calm, resonates with finality. I will not allow my son, or any student, to be subjected to this kind of harassment. You've crossed a line, and you will answer for it. Daniels, now visibly sweating, takes a step back. His hands fidget at his sides, and his gaze darts nervously between the principal and the crowd. The air is thick with tension, but it's clear that the balance of power has shifted. The officer who moments ago had commanded the scene now stands exposed, his authority stripped away. The principal takes another step forward, closing the distance between them. His voice drops, low and pointed. Pick up my son's belongings, Officer Daniels, now. The crowd gasps softly at the command. Daniels hesitates, his pride warring with the reality of the situation. Slowly, reluctantly, he bends down and begins gathering Jordan's books and belongings, placing them carefully back into the backpack. As Daniels works, the murmurs of the crowd swell into a wave of quiet applause. The sound is not just for the principal's words, but for what they represent: justice, accountability, and a rejection of the status quo. When Daniels finishes, Mr. Carter nods toward his son. Jordan steps forward, taking his backpack from the officer's trembling hands. The teen stands tall, his posture calm but resolute. There is no need for gloating. His dignity speaks for itself. Now, Mr. Carter says, his voice firm, I suggest you leave. We'll be having a formal conversation about this tomorrow, with your supervisor. Daniels nods stiffly, his face flushed with shame. Without another word, he retreats to his cruiser. The sound of the door slamming echoes across the lot as he drives away, his departure marked by the stares of those he left behind. The parking lot falls silent once more. Mr. Carter places a reassuring hand on his son's shoulder, his expression softening. Are you all right? He asks gently. Jordan nods. Yeah, he says quietly. Thanks, Dad. The principal smiles faintly. Always. As the crowd begins to disperse, the buzz of conversation lingers in the air. Phones are lowered, but the story has already been captured, its impact set to ripple far beyond this moment. This isn't just about one encounter. It's about a community standing together, about a father protecting his son, and about the power of accountability to challenge injustice. The crowd watches, spellbound, as Mr. Carter steps closer, his presence commanding yet composed. His eyes lock onto Officer Daniels, whose posture now betrays his unease. The officer, once exuding confidence, appears small in the shadow of the principal's steady authority. You dumped my son's belongings on the ground, Mr. Carter begins, his voice sharp and deliberate. Accused him without cause? Humiliated him in front of his peers? Tell me, Officer Daniels, is this what you call serving and protecting? The air is thick with anticipation, the crowd hanging onto every word. Daniels stiffens, his face pale, his mouth opening and closing as he struggles to respond. Finally, he stammers, I didn't know. No. Mr. Carter interrupts, his voice rising slightly, cutting through Daniel's excuses like a blade. You didn't know, but you assumed. And that assumption wasn't based on evidence or reason. It was based on your own bias. The crowd erupts in murmurs of agreement, the tide of public opinion visibly turning against the officer. Phones are raised higher, their cameras capturing every second of the unfolding moment. A young woman in the crowd mutters, "He's finally getting called out," her voice echoing the sentiment of the onlookers. Daniel's jaw tightens, his eyes darting toward the crowd. His composure is slipping, his authority dissolving under the weight of accountability. He takes a small step back, as though physically retreating from the principal's piercing words. Mr. Carter doesn't relent. "Do you understand the impact of your actions?" he asks, his tone unwavering. "Do you realize the message you've sent to every student, every parent watching this unfold? You've shown them that your badge is a tool for intimidation, not justice." Daniels opens his mouth as if to protest, but Mr. Carter silences him with a raised hand. "Save your excuses," the principal says firmly, "because they won't change what you've done here today." The crowd's murmurs grow louder, voices of support and indignation blending into a chorus of unity. "He's right," someone shouts. "This has gone on long enough." Another voice joins in. "Time to hold him accountable." Daniels glances nervously at the crowd, his confidence eroding with every passing second. His attempts to maintain control are futile. The collective power of the onlookers has shifted the dynamic completely. The phones capturing his every move serve as a reminder that his actions will not be forgotten or ignored. Mr. Carter continues, his voice steady but filled with conviction. "I will be filing a formal complaint with your department," he declares, "and I expect a full investigation into your conduct, not just today, but every day you've worked at this school." The weight of the principal's words lands heavily on Daniels. His face flushes with a mix of shame and frustration. He opens his mouth again, perhaps to defend himself, but the words die before they can form. He looks to the crowd, hoping for support, but all he finds are resolute faces and raised cameras. Realizing he has no ground to stand on, Daniels takes a step back. His authority, once wielded so freely, has crumbled under the weight of accountability. He glances at Mr. Carter one last time, his expression a mixture of defeat and resentment, before turning toward his cruiser. The crowd watches in silence as Daniels retreats. The officer who moments ago held the parking lot in his grip now walks away with slumped shoulders, his presence diminished to that of a man fleeing the consequences of his actions. The parking lot, once filled with murmurs and tension, begins to empty as the crowd disperses. Parents and students walk away, their faces etched with a mixture of disbelief and satisfaction. Some exchange quiet words, their voices carrying fragments of the confrontation they just witnessed. "That principal didn't hold back," one parent says to another. "Jordan didn't even flinch," a student remarks, shaking their head. Others leave in silence, the weight of what they saw lingering in their expressions. Jordan stands near the flagpole, his backpack slung back over his shoulder. The scattered contents have been hastily returned, though the disarray mirrors the feelings still swirling inside him. His father, Principal Carter, stands close, his presence steady and reassuring. He places a hand on Jordan's shoulder, firm but gentle. "This isn't over," Mr. Carter says softly, his voice low and deliberate. His words are meant only for his son, but the determination in them could silence an entire room. "We're going to make sure this never happens to you or anyone else again." Jordan nods, his gaze fixed on the ground. "Thanks, Dad," he replies quietly. His tone carries the weight of the day's events, a mix of exhaustion, frustration, and the faintest flicker of relief. Though his body feels heavy, his father's words kindle a small flame of hope. Later that evening, the scene replays in a different setting, the quiet of their living room. The television hums faintly in the background, casting a soft glow across the room. Jordan scrolls through his phone, his brows furrowing as he comes across a video. He watches it once, then again. The shaky recording, taken by a student, captures everything. The officer towering over him, scattering his belongings, and the firm, commanding presence of his father, stepping in to take control. Jordan hands the phone to his father, his voice quiet. "It's everywhere." Mr. Carter takes the phone, watching the video in silence. Below the footage, comments flood in. "This is unacceptable. That officer needs to be fired. Major respect to the dad for stepping in like that. How many kids go through this every day without someone there to help?" The likes, shares, and comments climb with every refresh. The video spreads across social media like wildfire, accompanied by hashtags, #justice for Jordan, #end the bias, #accountability. Now, by the time they finish dinner, the story has gone viral. The next morning, Jordan wakes to find his name trending. News stations have picked up the footage, playing it on repeat, with anchors dissecting every moment. The calm dignity he displayed, juxtaposed with the officer's aggression, becomes the focal point of the coverage. At school, students approach him with words of support. "That was brave, man," one says, clapping him on the shoulder. Others hang posters in the halls that read, "We stand with Jordan," and "Justice for all." The school district issues a statement later that day. Officer Daniels is placed on administrative leave, pending a full investigation. A review of the district's policies regarding law enforcement is announced, promising transparency and reform. The video continues to circulate, sparking conversations far beyond the school's walls. For many, Jordan becomes a symbol of resilience, proof that dignity and strength can shine even in the face of injustice. And as the world rallies around his story, he begins to understand the power of what he stood for. Not just himself, but everyone who has ever been in his shoes.